There are moments in life when everything you've ever known can vanish in a single heartbeat, leaving you standing alone in a world that suddenly feels too big and too empty all at once. For Clara Hensley, that moment came on a scorching July morning when her father collapsed in the wheat fields of Red Mesa Valley, taking with him every dream, every plan, and every ounce of certainty she'd ever held. With half the harvest still standing under the relentless sun and no one willing to work for a lone woman, Clara faced losing not just the crop, but the land her family had bled into for 3 generations. Then a stranger rode down from the mountain, a weathered man named Eli Ward, who claimed her father once saved his life. He came with calloused hands, few words, and a simple promise to finish what her father started. Through blistering heat and backbreaking days, they worked side by side, 2 broken souls mending more than fences and fields. But could a debt of honor turn into something neither of them expected? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Lonely Cowgirl's father died mid-season. Mountain Man finished the crop and said he'd be proud. There are moments in life when everything you've ever known can vanish in a single heartbeat, leaving you standing alone in a world that suddenly feels too big and too empty all at once. For Clara Hensley, that moment came on a scorching July morning when her father collapsed in the wheat fields of Red Mesa Valley, taking with him every dream, every plan, and every ounce of certainty she'd ever held. With half the harvest still standing under the relentless sun and no one willing to work for a lone woman, Clara faced losing not just the crop, but the land her family had bled into for 3 generations. Then a stranger rode down from the mountain, a weathered man named Eli Ward, who claimed her father once saved his life. He came with calloused hands, few words, and a simple promise to finish what her father started. Through blistering heat and backbreaking days, they worked side by side, 2 broken souls mending more than fences and fields. But could a debt of honor turn into something neither of them expected? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The dust hung in the air like a golden veil over Red Mesa Valley, suspended in the late afternoon light that painted everything the color of honey and amber. This was the land Thomas Hensley had loved, 300 acres of stubborn earth that demanded everything and gave back just enough to keep a family alive if they were willing to bleed for it. Clara stood at the kitchen window of the farmhouse, her father's work gloves clutched in her hands, the worn leather still holding the shape of his fingers, still carrying the faint smell of soil and honest sweat. She was 24 years old, though the mirror lately showed someone who looked older, with worry lines beginning to etch themselves around her eyes. Her dark hair, usually pinned back in a practical bun, had come loose during the morning's work, and strands of it stuck to her neck in the oppressive heat. She hadn't bothered to fix it. What did it matter now? The wheat fields stretched out beyond the window, half of them already harvested and lying in neat rows, waiting to be gathered and threshed. The other half still standing tall and golden, swaying in the hot wind that came down from the mountains. That wind carried the promise of more heat, more dry days that would turn the grain brittle if it wasn't brought in soon. Every farmer in the valley knew you had maybe 2 weeks of good weather after the wheat reached peak ripeness before you started losing yield. They were already 5 days into those 2 weeks, and the work had stopped completely 3 days ago. 3 days since Thomas Hensley had walked out to check the southwest field after breakfast and never walked back. Clara closed her eyes against the memory, but it came anyway, as vivid and terrible as the moment itself. She'd been kneading bread dough, her hands deep in the flour, when she'd felt it, that sudden coldness that had nothing to do with temperature, that sense of the world shifting on its axis. She'd run to the field, her heart already knowing what her mind refused to accept, and found him lying peacefully among his wheat, his face turned up to the sky he'd studied every morning for weather signs. his calloused hands still clutching a stalk of grain he'd been examining. The doctor said his heart had simply given out. 62 years of hard living, hard work, and a constitution that had seemed unbreakable until the moment it broke. There'd been no warning, no lingering illness, no time for goodbyes or final words of wisdom. Thomas Hensley had lived his whole life on this land, and he'd died on it too, which Clara supposed he would have wanted if he'd had a choice in the matter. The funeral had been well attended. Her father had been respected in Red Mesa Valley, known as a fair man, an honest dealer, someone who kept his word and expected the same from others. The small cemetery on the hill overlooking the valley had been crowded with neighbors and fellow farmers, their weathered faces solemn under their Sunday-best hats, their wives clutching handkerchiefs and casseroles, everyone murmuring the proper condolences. But Clara had seen the looks too, the sideways glances, the whispered conversations that stopped when she came near. She'd heard enough fragments to understand what they were saying. A woman alone, no husband, no brothers, father gone. How's she going to manage? She can't possibly, poor girl. Such a shame. And then Vernon Pritchard had approached her, right there at the graveside, before the last prayers were even finished. Vernon owned the largest spread in the valley, twice the size of the Hensley farm, and he'd been trying to buy her father out for years. Thomas had always refused. The land had been in the Hensley family for 3 generations, since Clara's grandfather had claimed it and broken the first furrows. And Thomas had meant for it to stay that way. Vernon was a large man, successful and wealthy by valley standards, with a thick moustache and eyes that calculated the value of everything they saw. He'd stood there in his expensive suit, hat in his hands in a show of respect that didn't quite reach his eyes, and made his offer. "Miss Clara," he'd said, his voice carrying just the right amount of sympathy, "I know this is a difficult time, but I want you to know that if you decide the farm is too much for you to handle alone, I'd be happy to take it off your hands. Fair price. Your father and I discussed it more than once. He knew I'd treat you right." Clara had looked at him, this man who'd circled her father's land like a vulture for years, and felt something hard and cold settle in her chest. "My father never had any intention of selling to you, Mr. Pritchard," she'd said quietly. "And neither do I." His expression had shifted then, the sympathy sliding away to reveal something harder underneath. "Now, Clara," he'd said, and she'd noticed he'd dropped the respectful miss, "you need to be practical. You can't run this place alone. You got half a harvest sitting in the fields, and harvest season doesn't wait for grief. You got no hands willing to work for a woman, no husband to help you, and no prospects I can see. You sell to me now, you'll get a fair price, and save yourself a lot of heartache. You wait until you lose the crop and the bank comes calling. You won't get half what I'm offering." She'd walked away without answering, her back straight and her chin up, but his words had followed her home and taken root in her mind because they were. Damn him, mostly true. That had been 4 days ago. 4 days of trying to hire workers and being turned down by every able-bodied man in the valley. Oh, they were polite about it, had other commitments, their own harvest to worry about. Times were tight, but Clara knew the real reason. They didn't believe she could pay them, not without a man to back her credit. They didn't want to be associated with what they saw as a failing enterprise. And some of them, she suspected, had been quietly discouraged by Vernon Pritchard, who had money enough to make it worth their while to stay away. She'd spent yesterday in the fields herself, trying to do the work alone. She'd managed to cut maybe a 1/4 acre of wheat with the hand scythe before her back had seized up and her hands had blistered so badly she could barely hold the handle. At that rate, it would take her 2 months to finish what needed to be done in 2 weeks. The mathematics of impossibility. Clara set the gloves down on the kitchen table and walked to the old pine chest that sat beneath the window, the one that had belonged to her mother. Sarah Hensley had died when Clara was 12, taken by pneumonia one brutal winter, and sometimes Clara could barely remember her face anymore. But she remembered her hands, gentle and capable, and her voice singing while she worked, and the way she'd made this drafty old farmhouse feel like a place of warmth and safety. Inside the chest were her mother's things, preserved carefully, a wedding dress wrapped in muslin, a few pieces of jewelry, a Bible with family names written in the front, and a small wooden box that held her mother's recipes. Written out in careful script on yellowed paper, Clara had been teaching herself to cook from these recipes, trying to recreate the tastes of her childhood. But she hadn't had much heart for it since her father died. Beneath the recipes was something else, a silver pocket watch that had belonged to her grandfather and passed to her father. Clara lifted it out carefully, feeling its weight in her palm. The case was engraved with words worn smooth by years of handling. Time and tide wait for no man. Her father had carried this watch every day of his life, checking it in the fields, marking the hours of planting and harvest, using it to time his breaks and judge the progress of the sun. He'd shown it to Clara when she was small, teaching her to read the Roman numerals on its face, explaining that time was the one thing you couldn't negotiate with. You had to respect it, work with it, never waste it. She opened the case and watched the second hand sweep around the face in its steady, relentless circle, tick, tick, tick. Each second another moment of harvest season slipping away. Each hour bringing her closer to losing everything her family had built. Clara closed the watch with a soft click and held it to her chest, feeling the tears finally come. The ones she'd been holding back through the funeral and the sympathetic visits and Vernon Pritchard's calculating offer. She sank down onto the floor beside the chest and let herself cry, great heaving sobs that came from somewhere deep and primal. The sound of a heart breaking under weight. It was never meant to carry alone. She cried for her father, for the conversation they'd never have, for the future he'd planned that would never come to pass. She cried for her mother, gone these 12 years but somehow more painfully absent now than ever. She cried for herself, for the impossible choice ahead, fight and probably fail, or surrender and lose the only home she'd ever known. When the tears finally subsided, Clara stayed there on the floor, exhausted and hollow. The light through the window had shifted, painting long shadows across the room. Evening was coming, and with it another day lost. Another day closer to failure. She pulled herself up slowly, her body aching from yesterday's futile labor, and walked to the kitchen sink to splash cold water on her face. The face that looked back at her from the small mirror above the sink was blotchy and swollen, her eyes red-rimmed and puffy. She looked like what she was, a young woman drowning in circumstances beyond her control. But beneath the tears and the exhaustion, something else flickered in her eyes. Something stubborn and unyielding, a spark of the same determination that had driven her father to work this unforgiving land for 40 years. She was Thomas Hensley's daughter, and Hensleys didn't quit. They might fail, might be beaten down by drought or debt or death itself, but they didn't quit. Clara dried her face and walked back to the table, picking up her father's gloves once more. Tomorrow she'd go back into the fields. She'd work until her body gave out, and then she'd rest just long enough to work again. It might not be enough. It probably wouldn't be enough. But she'd die trying before she'd hand this land over to Vernon Pritchard. She carried the gloves with her as she walked through the house, checking the windows and banking the fire in the stove, preparing for another night alone in the 2 quiet rooms. Her father's bedroom door stood open, his bed neatly made, his few possessions arranged just as he'd left them. She couldn't bring herself to disturb anything yet. It felt too final, too much like accepting he was really gone. Instead, she climbed the narrow stairs to her own small bedroom under the eaves, where the heat of the day still lingered, and changed into her nightgown. Through her window, she could see the wheat fields silvered by moonlight, beautiful and terrible in their abundance. So much wealth standing there, so much potential, and she had no way to claim it. Clara knelt beside her bed, her father's gloves still in her hands, and spoke to the God she'd been raised to believe watched over such things. She didn't ask for a miracle. She'd learned long ago that God helped those who helped themselves. But she asked for strength, for wisdom, for some path forward that she couldn't yet see. And if you could send help, she added silently, I'd be grateful. I don't know where it would come from, but I'd be grateful. She climbed into bed with the gloves beside her on the pillow, a talisman against the darkness, and fell into an exhausted sleep filled with dreams of wheat fields that stretched on forever, golden and unreachable. While she stood at the edge with bleeding hands and a breaking heart, she didn't know that 20 miles away, high in the mountain passes where the air was thin and cold, even in summer, a man sat beside a campfire and studied the same moon that lit her window. She didn't know that he'd heard about Thomas Hensley's death from a trader passing through, or that he'd spent the last 2 days wrestling with a debt 15 years old and a promise he'd never thought he'd have to keep. She didn't know that tomorrow, when the sun rose over Red Mesa Valley and painted her impossible wheat fields gold once more, she wouldn't be facing them alone, but she'd find out soon enough. Lonely Cowgirl's father died mid-season. Man finished the crop and said he'd be proud. There are moments in life when everything you've ever known can vanish in a single heartbeat, leaving you standing alone in a world that suddenly feels too big and too empty all at once. For Clara Hensley, that moment came on a scorching July morning when her father collapsed in the wheat fields of Red Mesa Valley, taking with him every dream, every plan, and every ounce of certainty she'd ever held. With half the harvest still standing under the relentless sun and no one willing to work for a lone woman, Clara faced losing not just the crop, but the land her family had bled into for 3 generations. Then a stranger rode down from the mountain, a weathered man named Eli Ward, who claimed her father once saved his life. He came with calloused hands, few words, and a simple promise to finish what her father started. Through blistering heat and backbreaking days, they worked side by side, 2 broken souls mending more than fences and fields. But could a debt of honor turn into something neither of them expected? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The dust hung in the air like a golden veil over Red Mesa Valley, suspended in the late afternoon light that painted everything the color of honey and amber. This was the land Thomas Hensley had loved, 300 acres of stubborn earth that demanded everything and gave back just enough to keep a family alive if they were willing to bleed for it. Clara stood at the kitchen window of the farmhouse, her father's work gloves clutched in her hands, the worn leather still holding the shape of his fingers, still carrying the faint smell of soil and honest sweat. She was 24 years old, though the mirror lately showed someone who looked older, with worry lines beginning to etch themselves around her eyes. Her dark hair, usually pinned back in a practical bun, had come loose during the morning's work, and strands of it stuck to her neck in the oppressive heat. She hadn't bothered to fix it. What did it matter now? The wheat fields stretched out beyond the window, half of them already harvested and lying in neat rows, waiting to be gathered and threshed. The other half still standing tall and golden, swaying in the hot wind that came down from the mountains. That wind carried the promise of more heat, more dry days that would turn the grain brittle if it wasn't brought in soon. Every farmer in the valley knew you had maybe 2 weeks of good weather after the wheat reached peak ripeness before you started losing yield. They were already 5 days into those 2 weeks, and the work had stopped completely 3 days ago. 3 days since Thomas Hensley had walked out to check the southwest field after breakfast and never walked back. Clara closed her eyes against the memory, but it came anyway, as vivid and terrible as the moment itself. She'd been kneading bread dough, her hands deep in the flour, when she'd felt it. That sudden coldness that had nothing to do with temperature, that sense of the world shifting on its axis. She'd run to the field, her heart already knowing what her mind refused to accept, and found him lying peacefully among his wheat, his face turned up to the sky he'd studied every morning for weather signs. His calloused hands still clutching a stalk of grain he'd been examining. The doctor said his heart had simply given out. 62 years of hard living, hard work, and a constitution that had seemed unbreakable until the moment it broke. There'd been no warning, no lingering illness, no time for goodbyes or final words of wisdom. Thomas Hensley had lived his whole life on this land, and he'd died on it too, which Clara supposed he would have wanted if he'd had a choice in the matter. The funeral had been well attended. Her father had been respected in Red Mesa Valley, known as a fair man, an honest dealer, someone who kept his word and expected the same from others. The small cemetery on the hill overlooking the valley had been crowded with neighbors and fellow farmers, their weathered faces solemn under their Sunday best hats, their wives clutching handkerchiefs and casseroles, everyone murmuring the proper condolences. But Clara had seen the looks too, the sideways glances, the whispered conversations that stopped when she came near. She'd heard enough fragments to understand what they were saying. A woman alone, no husband, no brothers, father gone. How's she going to manage? She can't possibly, poor girl. Such a shame. And then Vernon Pritchard had approached her right there at the graveside before the last prayers were even finished. Vernon owned the largest spread in the valley, twice the size of the Hensley farm, and he'd been trying to buy her father out for years. Thomas had always refused. The land had been in the Hensley family for 3 generations, since Clara's grandfather had claimed it and broken the first furrows, and Thomas had meant for it to stay that way. Vernon was a large man, successful and wealthy by valley standards, with a thick mustache and eyes that calculated the value of everything they saw. He'd stood there in his expensive suit, hat in his hands, in a show of respect that didn't quite reach his eyes, and made his offer. "Miss Clara," he'd said, his voice carrying just the right amount of sympathy, "I know this is a difficult time, but I want you to know that if you decide the farm is too much for you to handle alone, I'd be happy to take it off your hands. Fair price. Your father and I discussed it more than once. He knew I'd treat you right." Clara had looked at him, this man who'd circled her father's land like a vulture for years, and felt something hard and cold settle in her chest. "My father never had any intention of selling to you, Mr. Pritchard," she'd said quietly. "And neither do I." His expression had shifted then, the sympathy sliding away to reveal something harder underneath. "Now, Clara," he'd said, and she'd noticed he'd dropped the respectful "Miss," "you need to be practical. You can't run this place alone. You got half a harvest sitting in the fields, and harvest season doesn't wait for grief. You got no hands willing to work for a woman, no husband to help you, and no prospects I can see. You sell to me now, you'll get a fair price and save yourself a lot of heartache. You wait until you lose the crop and the bank comes calling. You won't get half what I'm offering." She'd walked away without answering, her back straight and her chin up, but his words had followed her home and taken root in her mind because they were, damn him, mostly true. That had been 4 days ago. 4 days of trying to hire workers and being turned down by every able-bodied man in the valley. Oh, they were polite about it, had other commitments, their own harvests to worry about. Times were tight, but Clara knew the real reason. They didn't believe she could pay them, not without a man to back her credit. They didn't want to be associated with what they saw as a failing enterprise. And some of them, she suspected, had been quietly discouraged by Vernon Pritchard, who had money enough to make it worth their while to stay away. She'd spent yesterday in the fields herself, trying to do the work alone. She'd managed to cut maybe a 1/4 acre of wheat with the hand scythe before her back had seized up, and her hands had blistered so badly she could barely hold the handle. At that rate, it would take her 2 months to finish what needed to be done in 2 weeks. The mathematics of impossibility. Clara set the gloves down on the kitchen table and walked to the old pine chest that sat beneath the window, the one that had belonged to her mother. Sarah Hensley had died when Clara was 12, taken by pneumonia one brutal winter, and sometimes Clara could barely remember her face anymore. But she remembered her hands, gentle and capable, and her voice singing while she worked, and the way she'd made this drafty old farmhouse feel like a place of warmth and safety. Inside the chest were her mother's things, preserved carefully, a wedding dress wrapped in muslin, a few pieces of jewelry, a Bible with family names written in the front, and a small wooden box that held her mother's recipes, written out in careful script on yellowed paper. Clara had been teaching herself to cook from these recipes, trying to recreate the tastes of her childhood. But she hadn't had much heart for it since her father died. Beneath the recipes was something else, a silver pocket watch that had belonged to her grandfather and passed to her father. Clara lifted it out carefully, feeling its weight in her palm. The case was engraved with words worn smooth by years of handling. Time and tide wait for no man. Her father had carried this watch every day of his life, checking it in the fields, marking the hours of planting and harvest, using it to time his breaks and judge the progress of the sun. He'd shown it to Clara when she was small, teaching her to read the Roman numerals on its face, explaining that time was the one thing you couldn't negotiate with. You had to respect it, work with it, never waste it. She opened the case and watched the second hand sweep around the face in its steady, relentless circle. Tick, tick, tick. Each second another moment of harvest season slipping away. Each hour bringing her closer to losing everything her family had built. Clara closed the watch with a soft click and held it to her chest, feeling the tears finally come, the ones she'd been holding back through the funeral and the sympathetic visits and Vernon Pritchard's calculating offer. She sank down onto the floor beside the chest and let herself cry. Great heaving sobs that came from somewhere deep and primal. The sound of a heart breaking under weight it was never meant to carry alone. She cried for her father, for the conversation they'd never have, for the future he'd planned that would never come to pass. She cried for her mother, gone these 12 years but somehow more painfully absent now than ever. She cried for herself, for the impossible choice ahead, fight and probably fail, or surrender and lose the only home she'd ever known. When the tears finally subsided, Clara stayed there on the floor, exhausted and hollow. The light through the window had shifted, painting long shadows across the room. Evening was coming, and with it another day lost. Another day closer to failure. She pulled herself up slowly, her body aching from yesterday's futile labor, and walked to the kitchen sink to splash cold water on her face. The face that looked back at her from the small mirror above the sink was blotchy and swollen, her eyes red-rimmed and puffy. She looked like what she was, a young woman drowning in circumstances beyond her control. But beneath the tears and the exhaustion, something else flickered in her eyes, something stubborn and unyielding, a spark of the same determination that had driven her father to work this unforgiving land for 40 years. She was Thomas Hensley's daughter, and Hensleys didn't quit. They might fail, might be beaten down by drought or death itself, but they didn't quit. Clara dried her face and walked back to the table, picking up her father's gloves once more. Tomorrow she'd go back into the fields. She'd work until her body gave out, and then she'd rest just long enough to work again. It might not be enough. It probably wouldn't be enough. But she'd die trying before she'd hand this land over to Vernon Pritchard. She carried the gloves with her as she walked through the house, checking the windows and banking the fire in the stove, preparing for another night alone in the 2 quiet rooms. Her father's bedroom door stood open, his bed neatly made, his few possessions arranged just as he'd left them. She couldn't bring herself to disturb anything yet. It felt too final, too much like accepting he was really gone. Instead, she climbed the narrow stairs to her own small bedroom under the eaves, where the heat of the day still lingered and changed into her nightgown. Through her window, she could see the wheat fields silvered by moonlight, beautiful and terrible in their abundance. So much wealth standing there, so much potential, and she had no way to claim it. Clara knelt beside her bed, her father's gloves still in her hands, and spoke to the God she'd been raised to believe watched over such things. She didn't ask for a miracle. She'd learned long ago that God helped those who helped themselves. But she asked for strength, for wisdom, for some path forward that she couldn't yet see. And if you could send help, she added silently, I'd be grateful. I don't know where it would come from, but I'd be grateful. She climbed into bed with the gloves beside her on the pillow, a talisman against the darkness, and fell into an exhausted sleep, filled with dreams of wheat fields that stretched on forever, golden and unreachable. While she stood at the edge with bleeding hands and a breaking heart, she didn't know that 20 miles away, High in the mountain passes where the air was thin and cold even in summer, a man sat beside a campfire and studied the same moon that lit her window. She didn't know that he'd heard about Thomas Hensley's death from a trader passing through, or that he'd spent the last 2 days wrestling with a debt 15 years old, and a promise he'd never thought he'd have to keep. She didn't know that tomorrow, when the sun rose over Red Mesa Valley and painted her impossible wheat fields gold once more, she wouldn't be facing them alone, but she'd find out soon enough. The sun hadn't cleared the horizon when Clara heard Eli moving around in the barn. She'd been awake for an hour already, too nervous to sleep, too full of anxious energy to lie still. She'd dressed in her oldest work clothes, canvas trousers that had belonged to her father, cut down and re-sewn to fit her smaller frame, and a worn cotton shirt with the sleeves rolled up. Her hair was braided tight and pinned close to her head to keep it out of the way. She'd made breakfast again, more eggs, more bacon, fresh bread, and had it waiting when Eli knocked on the kitchen door. "Morning," he said, and she noticed he looked as rested as if he'd slept in a feather bed instead of on the hard barn floor. "Morning," Clara replied. "Coffee's ready." They ate quickly, neither of them much for conversation this early. But the silence felt different from yesterday, less awkward, more companionable, like two people who'd found a working rhythm even before the work truly began. When they'd finished, Eli helped her clear the dishes without being asked, then led the way out to the barn. He'd already harnessed one of the horses to the plow, Clara saw, and he'd laid out the scythes and sharpened them both until they gleamed in the early light. "You take the plow," Eli said. "Follow the rows your father already started. Keep it straight and don't rush. I'll follow behind with the scythe, cutting what you turn up. When we've got a good amount cut, we'll stop and bundle it. Then we'll start again." Clara nodded, her heart beating fast. She'd driven the plow before, helping her father, but never on her own. Never with this much riding on her ability to do it right. She took her position behind the plow horse, a sturdy mare named Betsy, who'd been with the family for 8 years. Betsy knew the work at least, even if Clara wasn't entirely sure of herself. "Ready?" Eli asked. "Ready," Clara said, trying to sound more confident than she felt. "Then let's get to it." The first hour was hard. Clara's arms burned from holding the plow steady, and her back ached from the constant forward hunch required to keep the blade at the right angle. Sweat ran down her face, despite the relative cool of early morning, and she could feel blisters forming on her palms, even through the protection of her father's gloves. But she kept going, one row and then another, following the straight lines her father had begun. Behind her, she could hear the steady swish of Eli's scythe, the rhythmic sound of wheat stalks falling, the occasional pause as he stopped to wipe his own brow or take a drink from the canteen he'd brought. They worked in silence for the most part, except for the occasional instruction from Eli, a little to the left or good. "Keep that angle," or simply, "You're doing fine." By mid-morning, the sun had climbed high enough to be brutal, and Clara's whole body screamed for rest. But she didn't want to be the first to stop, didn't want to show weakness. It was Eli who finally called the break. "Hold up," he said, and Clara stopped gratefully, her hands shaking as she released the plow handles. Eli came around to where she stood and examined her palms. "Blisters," he said, not unkindly. "You should have said something sooner." "I'm fine," Clara said, though she wasn't sure if that was true. "You're tough," Eli corrected. "There's a difference. Come on." He led her to a spot of shade near the edge of the field, where he'd stashed a water bucket and some clean cloth. He had her sit down, then soaked the cloth in the cool water and wrapped it around her hands. "Keep that on for a few minutes," he said. "Let the heat and swelling come down." Clara sat obediently, too tired to argue. She watched as Eli drank deeply from his own canteen, then poured some of the water over his head, running his wet hands through his hair and beard. It was a simple gesture, but there was something almost intimate about watching him in this unguarded moment. "How much did we get done?" she asked. "About 3 acres, Eli said. "Maybe a little more." "It's a good start." "We have 150 acres to cut," Clara said, the enormity of it hitting her again. "We have 10 days, Eli replied calmly. "That's 15 acres a day." We're already a quarter of the way there for today. We keep at this pace, we'll make it. You really believe that? I do, Eli said. He sat down in the shade near her, not close enough to be improper, but close enough that she could see the sweat still gleaming on his face, the dust coating his arms. Your father and I, we talked about a lot of things during those weeks he was taking care of me. He told me about this place, about the work it took to keep it going, about the satisfaction of bringing in a good crop. He said farming was about faith as much as anything. Faith that the rain would come when you needed it. Faith that the seeds you planted would grow. Faith that the work you did would matter. Clara felt her throat tighten. He said that to you? He did, Eli said. And I think he'd want you to have that same faith now. Not blind optimism, your father was too practical for that. But faith that if you do the work, if you keep moving forward, things have a way of working out. I want to believe that, Clara said quietly. Then believe it, Eli said simply. Now let's see those hands. He unwrapped the cloth and examined her palms again. The blisters were already forming, red and angry-looking, but the cool water had helped. From his pocket, Eli pulled a small tin and opened it to reveal a yellowish salve. This will help, he said. Made it myself from pine sap and other things. Keeps blisters from getting infected and helps them heal faster. He applied the salve gently, his rough fingers surprisingly tender, and Clara found herself studying his face as he worked. There were deep lines around his eyes and mouth, marks of a life lived mostly outdoors, mostly alone. But there was kindness in those lines, too. Laugh lines, her mother would have called them, though Clara hadn't seen Eli laugh yet. There, he said, finishing. That should do it. We'll wrap them again after lunch. They worked through the rest of the morning and into the early afternoon, taking breaks when they needed them, pushing when they could. By the time Eli called a halt for the day, they'd cut nearly 5 acres, better than their target, but at a cost Clara could feel in every muscle. That's enough, Eli said. Any more and we'll be too sore to work tomorrow. Clara didn't argue. She could barely stand, let alone plow another row. They walked back to the house together, both of them covered in dust and chaff, both of them moving like old people. Go clean up, Eli said. I'll tend the horses. Clara went inside and washed at the basin, watching the water turn brown with dirt. Her face in the mirror was sunburned and streaked with dust, her eyes tired but something else too. Not quite happy but not defeated either. Determined, maybe. Purposeful. She changed into a clean dress and set about making supper. Her hands hurt, but the salve had helped, and the work of cooking was familiar enough that she could do it almost without thinking. When the food was ready, she brought Eli's portion out to the barn again. But this time, he stopped her. If you don't mind, he said, I'd rather eat at the table. Gets lonely, eating alone every meal. Clara hesitated. It wasn't proper, exactly, to have an unmarried man in her house for meals. But then again, nothing about this situation was proper. And the truth was, she'd gotten tired of eating alone too. All right, she said. Come on in. They sat at the kitchen table together, and this time the conversation came easier. Eli told her about his life in the mountains. Not much, just small pieces, like how he tracked the seasons by the movements of game, or how he'd once spent an entire winter snowed in, with nothing but his thoughts and his books for company. What books? Clara asked, curious despite herself. Whatever I can get, Eli said. Traders bring them through sometimes. I've got a Bible, some Shakespeare, a collection of Emerson essays. Not much, but enough to keep my mind from going dull. You read Shakespeare? Clara couldn't hide her surprise. Eli smiled. The first real smile she'd seen from him, and it transformed his face, made him look younger and more approachable. City folks always seem surprised when mountain men can read, he said. I had an education, same as anyone. My father was a school teacher back in Pennsylvania. He made sure I knew my letters and numbers before I ever headed west. What brought you out here? Clara asked. The smile faded. Same thing that brings most men west, he said. Running from something, looking for something, maybe both. Clara wanted to ask more, but something in his expression told her that was all she'd get for now. Instead, she said, my mother taught me to read. We didn't have many books, but we had enough. And she'd make up stories too, when we couldn't afford new ones. Stories about princesses and adventures and happy endings. You miss her, Eli said. It wasn't a question. Every day, Clara admitted. But I think I miss her more now, with my father gone too. I feel like an orphan, even though I'm too old to be one. You're never too old to miss your parents, Eli said quietly. I lost mine 20 years ago, and I still think about them. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, and Clara realized something. For the first time since her father died, she didn't feel completely alone. This stranger, this mountain man who'd appeared out of nowhere, understood grief. He'd carried his own, and it made him gentle with hers. Thank you, she said suddenly, for being here, for helping, for all of it. Eli met her eyes across the table. No thanks needed, he said. I'm paying a debt, that's all. It feels like more than that, Clara said. Maybe it is, Eli admitted. But let's just take it one day at a time. Like the harvest. That night, Clara fell asleep almost before her head hit the pillow, too exhausted even for the worried thoughts that had been plaguing her. And in the barn, Eli sat up late, sharpening the scythes again for tomorrow's work, thinking about the woman in the house and the promise he'd made to her father. He'd told her the truth. He was here to pay a debt. But there was more to it than that, though he hadn't found the words to explain it yet. Thomas Hensley had saved his life, yes. But more than that, Thomas had showed him that there were still good people in the world. People who helped without expecting payment. People who saw a stranger suffering and didn't just pass by. Eli had been alone in the mountains for a long time, and he'd told himself he preferred it that way. No complications, no obligations. No risk of losing anyone else the way he'd lost everyone who'd ever mattered to him. But sitting here in this barn, working this land, eating supper at that kitchen table with Thomas's daughter, it reminded him of things he'd almost forgotten. The satisfaction of shared work, the comfort of companionship, the simple pleasure of belonging somewhere, even if just for a little while. He finished sharpening the second scythe and tested the edge carefully. Sharp enough to cut wheat cleanly, sharp enough to do the work that needed doing. Tomorrow they'd rise before dawn and do it all again. And the day after that, and the day after that, until the harvest was done and the debt was paid. And then, well, he'd think about that when the time came. For now, he had work to do. And that was enough. The second week of harvest brought a shift in the weather, not the catastrophic drought Clara had feared, but a persistent, oppressive heat that seemed to press down on the valley like a physical weight. The sun rose each morning into a sky bleached white with heat, and by midday the air shimmered over the fields in waves that made the horizon dance and blur. They adapted their schedule, starting even earlier to capture the coolest hours of the day, then retreating to shade during the worst of the afternoon heat, before resuming work in the evening. It meant longer days overall, but it was the only way to continue making progress without collapsing from heat exhaustion. Clara had taken to soaking kerchiefs in cold water and tying them around her neck, letting the moisture evaporate against her skin for a few minutes of relief. Eli did the same, and they developed a system of checking on each other throughout the day, watching for signs of dizziness or confusion that might signal heat sickness. It was during one of their afternoon breaks, huddled in the shade of a lone cottonwood tree at the edge of the north field, that Clara noticed Eli staring at something in the distance. "What is it?" she asked. "Riders," he said quietly. "3 of them, coming from the direction of Pritchard's place." Clara's stomach tightened. She shaded her eyes and looked where Eli was pointing, and sure enough, she could make out 3 horses kicking up dust on the road that led to her farm. "Should we go meet them?" she asked. "No," Eli said. "Let them come to us, but stay close." They waited in the shade as the riders approached, and as they got closer, Clara recognized them. 3 of Vernon Pritchard's hired hands, men she'd seen in town but never spoken to. They were rough-looking characters, the kind who worked as much with intimidation as with actual labor. The lead rider, a man with a scarred face and mean eyes, pulled up about 20 feet away. His 2 companions flanked him, hands resting casually near their holstered pistols. "Miss Hensley," the scarred man said, not bothering with any more formal greeting. "Mr. Pritchard sent us to check on some fence line issues. Says the boundary between your property and his has been disputed for some time. There's no dispute, Clara said, keeping her voice steady. The boundary is where it's always been, marked by the stone posts my grandfather set. Well, now that's interesting, the man said, because Mr. Pritchard has some old survey maps that suggest differently. Says your father might have been farming on Pritchard land for years without realizing it. That's a lie, Clara said flatly. The scarred man's expression hardened. You calling Mr. Pritchard a liar? Before Clara could respond, Eli stepped forward. He didn't move aggressively, didn't reach for any weapon, but something about the way he positioned himself between Clara and the riders, balanced and ready, made the three men shift uneasily in their saddles. I think what Miss Hensley means, Eli said, his voice mild but carrying an edge of steel underneath, is that there's been no boundary dispute in the 30 years Thomas Hensley worked this land. So it's curious that one would spring up now, just when the harvest is coming in and the farm's at its most vulnerable. The scarred man's hand moved closer to his pistol. You'd be the mountain man, he said, the one who's been staying here. Lot of talk in town about that. I imagine there is, Eli said. People do love to talk. Mr. Pritchard's wondering what your interest is in all this, the man continued. Whether you're being paid, or if there's some other arrangement between you and Miss Hensley here. Clara felt her face flush with anger, but Eli's expression didn't change at all. My interest, he said quietly, is in helping a friend's daughter bring in her harvest. What happens after that is nobody's business but our own. That's so. The scarred man smiled, showing yellowed teeth. Well, maybe we ought to inspect these disputed fence lines right now. Make sure Miss Hensley here knows where her property ends and Mr. Pritchard's begins. The fence lines are fine where they are, Clara said. And I'd appreciate it if you'd leave my property now. The three men exchanged glances, and for a moment Clara thought they might actually start something. But then the scarred man shrugged and gathered his reins. Just trying to be neighborly, he said. Mr. Pritchard likes to keep things clear between properties. Avoid misunderstandings. No misunderstanding here, Eli said. The boundaries are where they've always been. And they're going to stay that way. The men rode off slowly, not hurrying, making it clear they weren't intimidated. But they left, which was what mattered. When they were out of sight, Clara let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. What was that about? Intimidation, Eli said. Pritchard's trying to rattle you, make you feel like you can't win. He probably figures if he can't buy you out, he'll squeeze you out. Can he do that? Claim the boundaries are different. He can try, Eli said, but property boundaries are public record. Your grandfather's original claim and all subsequent surveys are filed with the county. Unless Pritchard's willing to commit outright fraud, and I'm not saying he isn't, he doesn't have a legal leg to stand on. But he has men willing to push fences over in the middle of the night, Clara said. Or damage equipment. Or worse, Eli nodded slowly. He might. Which is why from now on, one of us needs to stay near the house at all times. And we need to be watchful. That evening after supper, Clara found herself unable to settle. She kept going to the windows, looking out into the gathering darkness, half expecting to see riders returning. Eli noticed, of course. They won't come tonight, he said. That was just a message, letting you know they could come if they wanted to. Actually doing something would risk more than Pritchard's willing to risk right now. How do you know? Clara asked. Because I've known men like him before, Eli said. They're bullies. They push to see if you'll break, but they don't want real trouble unless they have to. And right now, he's still hoping you'll sell to him. If his men actually harmed you or damaged your property in a provable way, that would bring the law down on him, and he doesn't want that. So what does he want? He wants you scared, Eli said simply. He wants you to feel like you're in over your head, like giving up would be easier than fighting. That's his whole strategy. Clara thought about that, about Vernon Pritchard's calculations and assumptions, about how he saw her as someone who could be frightened into submission. Then he doesn't know me very well, she said. Eli smiled. No, he agreed. I don't think he does. Later that night, after Eli had gone to the barn, Clara went to her father's room for the first time since his death. She'd been avoiding it, unable to face the emptiness, but now she felt drawn there. The room was exactly as he'd left it. His clothes hung on pegs. His boots stood by the door. His Bible lay on the small table beside the bed, a leather bookmark protruding from somewhere in Psalms. Clara sat on the edge of the bed and opened the Bible to the marked page. Her father's handwriting was in the margin, a note dated just 2 weeks before his death. "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He makes me lie down in green pastures." And beside it, in smaller letters, "Remember to check fence in green pasture field." Even in his devotions, her father had been thinking about the farm. It made Clara smile through the sudden tears. She noticed something else then, a loose board in the floor beside the bed, slightly raised. Clara knelt down and pried it up carefully, wondering if this was where her father had hidden money or important papers, or something else she'd need. What she found was a journal, leather-bound and worn, filled with her father's neat handwriting. Clara lifted it out carefully and opened to a random page. "Clara's growing into a fine woman, smart, capable, stronger than she knows. Sometimes I worry about leaving her alone. Not because she can't manage, but because this valley doesn't always know what to do with a woman who can stand on her own. I've been teaching her everything I can about running the farm. But I worry it won't be enough if something happens to me before she finds a good partner to share the work." Clara turned more pages, finding entries that went back years. Her father had kept this journal as a record of his thoughts, his worries, his observations about life and farming and raising a daughter alone. She found an entry from 15 years ago, dated late summer. "Strange thing happened today. Was hunting in the high country and came across a man who'd been mauled by a bear. Young fellow, maybe mid-20s, more dead than alive. Couldn't leave him, so I stayed with him. His name is Eli Ward. He's from back east originally, lost his whole family to disease. Came west to get away from the memories. I understand that impulse. We've been talking these past weeks while he heals. He's a good man, educated, thoughtful, living alone in the mountains like some kind of hermit. Told him if he ever needs anything, my door is open. He said the same. Doubt I'll ever take him up on it, but it's good to know there are still men in the world who honor their word." Clara read the passage 3 times, her heart beating faster with each reading. Her father had known, not just that Eli would come if called, but that Eli was exactly the kind of man who would honor a debt, who would show up when needed, who could be trusted. Had her father suspected his heart might give out? Had he kept in contact with Eli over the years, making sure that promise stayed alive just in case? She turned to the last entry, written the morning of the day her father died. Chest pain again this morning, but not bad. Should probably see the doctor, but harvest is coming, and there's no time. Clara is worried about managing on her own, though she tries not to show it. I've taught her well, but I know she's afraid. I wish I could promise her everything will be fine, that she won't lose this place her grandfather built. But all I can do is trust that I've prepared her for whatever comes. She's stronger than she thinks. She's braver than she knows. And if I've done my job right, she'll figure that out when she needs to." Clara closed the journal and held it to her chest, crying quietly in her father's room. He'd known. Maybe not that he'd die that day, but he'd known his time was short. And he'd tried to prepare her, to give her the tools and the confidence she'd need. And somehow, through a promise made 15 years ago to a wounded stranger in the mountains, he'd arranged for help to come when she needed it most. She took the journal with her back to her own room and placed it on her nightstand, next to her father's pocket watch. These were her inheritance, she realized. Not just land and wheat fields, but her father's wisdom, his love, his faith that she could carry on what he'd built. Tomorrow she'd show Eli the journal. Let him read what her father had written about him. But tonight, she'd simply hold on to this gift her father had left her, the knowledge that even in death, he was still taking care of her. In the barn, Eli lay awake on his bedroll, staring up at the dark beams overhead. He'd seen the way those men had looked at Clara, the barely veiled threat in their words. Vernon Pritchard was escalating, and Eli knew from experience that men like that didn't stop until they got what they wanted, or were stopped by force. He'd told Clara they wouldn't come tonight, But he wasn't entirely sure of that. So he lay there, fully clothed, his rifle within easy reach, listening to the night sounds and ready to respond if anything seemed out of place. Hours passed. Midnight came and went. And finally, just before dawn, Eli let himself relax slightly. They'd made it through another night, but the threat remained, hanging over them like the heat that shimmered over the fields. They could finish the harvest, could bring in every stalk of wheat. And it still might not be enough if Pritchard was determined to take the farm. Eli thought about Thomas Hensley, about the promise he'd made 15 years ago, about the debt he'd come here to repay. He'd thought it was simple: help with the harvest, honor his friend's memory, then disappear back into the mountains where he belonged. But nothing about this was turning out to be simple. Clara needed more than help with the harvest. She needed protection. She needed an ally who wouldn't be intimidated by men like Pritchard's hired thugs. She needed someone willing to stand beside her, not just until the wheat was gathered, but until the farm was truly safe. And the truth Eli was starting to face, lying there in the darkness with dawn approaching, was that he wanted to be that person. Not out of obligation, not out of debt, but because somewhere in these 2 weeks of working beside Clara, of sharing meals and conversations and the simple rhythms of daily life, he'd started to feel something he hadn't felt in 20 years. He'd started to feel like he belonged somewhere, like maybe, just maybe, he'd found a reason to come down from the mountains for good. The thought terrified him, but it also felt right in a way. Nothing had felt right in a very long time. He'd think about it more later. For now, the sun was starting to paint the eastern sky with the first hints of dawn. And there was work to be done. Always there was work to be done, and he was grateful for it, because work kept him from thinking too hard about the impossible things he was starting to want. The heat broke on the 16th day after Eli's arrival, not with rain, but with a shift in the wind that brought cooler air down from the mountains. It was a relief beyond words, like the land itself had been holding its breath and could finally exhale. They were 3/4 through the harvest now, ahead of schedule, despite the heat and the broken equipment and Vernon Pritchard's harassment. The work had become almost meditative, the rhythm of the plough, the swing of the scythe, the methodical bundling of cut wheat. Clara's body had fully adapted to the labor, moving with efficiency that would have amazed her 3 weeks ago. But more than her body had changed. She'd become comfortable with Eli's presence in a way she'd never been comfortable with anyone outside her family. They'd developed an unspoken language of gestures and glances, could work for hours without speaking and still understand each other perfectly. She'd shown him her father's journal 3 days ago, letting him read the entries about their first meeting. Eli had been quiet for a long time after, his weathered face unreadable, and when he'd finally spoken, his voice had been rough with emotion. He was a good man, he'd said simply. The best kind. He thought the same of you, Clara had replied. That evening, after they'd finished the day's work, Eli had done something unexpected. He'd pulled out a battered harmonica from his pack and begun to play. The music had been startling in its beauty, slow, mournful melodies that spoke of loneliness and longing, of vast spaces and quiet nights. Clara had sat on the porch steps listening, watching Eli's weathered hands move over the instrument with surprising delicacy, and she'd felt something shift inside her chest. This man who'd lived alone in the mountains for 20 years, who seemed so self-sufficient and complete unto himself, had carried beauty with him all that time, had played music to the trees and the stars with no one to hear it but himself. When he'd finished, she'd said, "That was lovely. Where did you learn to play?" "I taught myself," Eli had replied. "Long winters get lonely. A man needs something to fill the silence. Will you play again sometime?" "If you'd like." "I would like," Clara had said, and the small smile he'd given her had made her breath catch. Since then, evenings had taken on a new quality. After supper, they'd sit on the porch together while Eli played. Sometimes lively tunes that made Clara want to dance, sometimes slow ballads that brought tears to her eyes. And sometimes they'd just talk, sharing stories from their different lives. Finding unexpected common ground, Clara had told him about her mother, about learning to cook and sew and keep house, about the loneliness after her mother died and the way her father had tried to be both parents to her. Eli had shared more about his years in the mountains, not just the hardships, but the beauty too, the satisfaction of living close to the land, the peace that came from simplicity. "Don't you get lonely?" Clara had asked one evening. "I did," Eli had admitted, "especially at first. But after a while, loneliness becomes normal. You forget what it's like to be around people, to have conversations that go deeper than trading for supplies. Do you miss it? The mountains, I mean. While you're here?" Eli had been quiet for a long moment. "No," he'd finally said. "That surprises me, but no, I don't miss it at all." Now, on this cooler morning, with the harvest nearing completion, Clara found herself thinking about what would happen when it was done. Eli had said he'd leave when the debt was paid. Would he really just ride back into the mountains and disappear? The thought left her hollow. They were working the last section of the west field when Clara heard Eli call out sharply. She stopped the plow and turned to see him standing very still, looking at something on the ground. "What is it?" she called. "Fence post," he said, his voice tight. "Pushed over." "And the fence wire's been cut." Clara's stomach sank as she walked over to where Eli stood. Sure enough, 3 posts had been knocked down, and the wire between them snipped clean through. "It had happened recently, probably last night while they slept." "Pritchard," Clara said. "Most likely," Eli agreed. "Or his men on his orders." They spent the next 2 hours repairing the damage, working quickly but carefully. The cut wire was harder to fix than a broken strap or cracked plow blade, but Eli managed to splice it back together in a way that would hold. "This is just the beginning," Clara said as they worked. "He's going to keep doing things like this, isn't he? Even after the harvest is done?" "Probably," Eli said. "Unless something changes his calculations." "Like what?" "Like you having someone here permanently. Someone who can't be intimidated. Someone who makes it clear you're not alone and vulnerable." Clara looked at him sharply. "Are you offering to stay?" Eli didn't meet her eyes, focused intently on the fence repair. "I'm saying that if you had a partner, someone to help run this place, someone to stand with you against men like Pritchard, a lot of your problems would solve themselves." "I can't afford to hire someone full-time," Clara said. "Even if I could find someone willing to work for a woman." "I wasn't talking about hiring," Eli said quietly. Clara's heart began to beat faster. "What were you talking about then?" Eli finished splicing the wire and tested it to make sure it would hold. Only then did he turn to face her, his grey eyes serious. "I've been thinking," he said carefully, "about what happens after the harvest, about where I go, what I do. And the truth is, I'm not eager to go back to the mountains. These past weeks, working this land with you, having someone to talk to, having a purpose beyond just surviving, it's reminded me of things I thought I'd left behind for good." "What kind of things?" Clara asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Connection," Eli said. "Belonging. The satisfaction of building something instead of just existing. I've been alone a long time, Clara, maybe too long. So what are you saying?" Eli took a deep breath. "I'm saying that if you'd have me, I'd like to stay. Not as hired help, but as a partner. We'd work this farm together, share the labor and the profits. I'd help you deal with Pritchard and anyone else who tried to push you around. And in return," he paused, seeming to struggle with the words, "in return, I'd have a home, a place to belong, someone to belong with." Clara felt tears prickling her eyes. "Are you asking to marry me?" "Not yet," Eli said quickly. "I know this is sudden. I know we've only known each other a few weeks. But I'm asking if you'd be open to that possibility. If you'd let me stay and see where this goes between us. No pressure, no expectations beyond partnership and mutual respect. Just a chance." Clara looked at this man who'd appeared out of nowhere when she needed him most, who'd worked beside her without complaint, who'd shown her nothing but kindness and respect and honest companionship. She thought about her father's journal entry, about how he'd recognized Eli as a good man 15 years ago. She thought about the comfortable silences they'd shared, the easy conversations, the way he made her laugh and made her feel capable and strong. And she thought about the alternative. Eli riding back into the mountains, leaving her alone again to face Vernon Pritchard and an uncertain future. "Yes," she said. "Yes, I'd be open to that possibility. I'd welcome it, actually." Eli's face transformed with a smile that made him look 10 years younger. Yeah, Clara confirmed, smiling back through her tears. "You can stay, Eli, as my partner, and we'll see where it goes from there." He reached out and took her hand, his rough palm warm against hers, and they stood there by the repaired fence, looking at each other like people who'd just discovered an unexpected treasure. "Thank you," Eli said quietly. "No," Clara replied. "Thank you. For coming, for staying, for being—" She paused, searching for the right words. "For being exactly who you are." They went back to work then, but something had shifted between them. The work felt different now, not like a temporary arrangement with an expiration date, but like the beginning of something permanent. They were building a future together, one row of wheat at a time. That evening, Clara cooked the beef stew again, wanting to mark the occasion somehow. As they sat down to eat, she felt lighter than she had since her father's death, as if a weight she hadn't fully acknowledged had been lifted from her shoulders. "I think we should go to town tomorrow," she said. "We're running low on supplies, and I want to stop by the county office. Check those property records you mentioned. Make sure Pritchard can't actually claim any boundary disputes." "Good idea," Eli said. "And while we're there, I should probably let it be known that I'm staying permanently. Might discourage some of Pritchard's more aggressive plans if he knows you're not alone." "People will talk," Clara warned. "Let them talk," Eli said with a shrug. "We're not doing anything wrong. We're two people helping each other, working together, building a life. If that scandalizes folks, that's their problem, not ours," Clara laughed. "You sound like my father." "I'll take that as a compliment," Eli said, smiling. After supper, Eli played his harmonica again, and this time the music was lighter, more hopeful. Clara found herself swaying to the rhythm, and on impulse, she stood up and held out her hand. "Dance with me," she said. Eli looked startled. "I don't really know how." "Neither do I," Clara said. "But who cares? There's no one here to judge us." He set down the harmonica and took her hand, and they moved together in an awkward, unpracticed dance on the porch under the emerging stars. They stepped on each other's feet and laughed about it. And Eli's arm around her waist felt solid and right and full of promise. When they finally stopped, both slightly breathless and grinning, Eli looked at her with an expression that made Clara's heart skip. "This is nice," he said softly. "This feeling. I'd forgotten what it was like." "What feeling?" Clara asked, though she thought she knew. "Hope," Eli said. "Happiness. The sense that tomorrow might be even better than today." "I feel it too," Clara admitted. They stood close together on the porch, and Clara thought that Eli might kiss her. She wouldn't have stopped him. But instead, he just squeezed her hand gently and said, "I should turn in. Early start tomorrow if we're going to town." "All right," Clara said, trying not to feel disappointed. "Good night, Eli." "Good night, Clara." She watched him walk back to the barn, and she knew he was being careful, respecting her, not rushing into anything that might make her uncomfortable. It was exactly what she should have wanted, but part of her wished he'd been a little less careful, a little more impulsive. In her room that night, Clara pulled out her mother's old letters from the pine chest and read through them by candlelight. They were letters her mother had written to her father during their courtship, back when Thomas had been working a claim 100 miles away, and Sarah had been waiting in town for him to make his fortune. The letters were full of longing and hope and practical observations about daily life. They spoke of a love that had grown slowly, built on mutual respect and shared values rather than sudden passion. And reading them, Clara understood that what she was building with Eli was following the same pattern. It wasn't a whirlwind romance out of some storybook. It was something steadier, something that would last, a partnership that might deepen into love, given time and patience and the daily choice to build something together. Her mother would have approved, Clara thought. And her father, well, he'd all but arranged it, hadn't he? Saving Eli's life, keeping that connection alive, making sure that when Clara needed help, Eli would be the one to answer. "Thanks, Papa," she whispered into the darkness. "You took care of me, even from beyond the grave." Outside, the wheat fields rustled in the cool night breeze, 2/3 of them already cut and bundled, waiting to be gathered and sold. One more week, maybe 10 days, and the harvest would be complete. The immediate crisis would be over, and then the real work would begin. The work of building a life, of defending what they'd built, of turning a tentative partnership into something that could weather whatever storms the future brought. But for tonight, it was enough to know she wasn't alone. That tomorrow she'd wake up and Eli would still be there, ready to work beside her, to stand with her, to face whatever came. It was enough. More than enough. It was everything. The trip to town took most of the morning. Clara drove the wagon with Eli riding alongside on his bay horse, both of them dressed in their best clothes, which for Eli meant a clean shirt and his least worn trousers, and for Clara meant a simple blue dress that had been her Sunday best before her father died. Red Mesa was a small town, just a main street with a general store, a bank, a saloon, a church, and the county office, housed in what had once been a private residence. As they rode in, Clara felt the weight of eyes on them, saw curtains twitching in windows, noticed conversations stopping as they passed. "Let them look," she thought, lifting her chin. "Let them see that I'm not giving up." They stopped first at the general store for supplies, flour, sugar, coffee, a few other necessities. The store owner, Mr. Patterson, was polite but cool, his eyes flicking between Clara and Eli with obvious curiosity. "Here you've got help with the harvest," he said, as he tallied their purchases. "I do," Clara said. "This is Eli Ward. He knew my father." "That's so," Mr. Patterson said, not quite making it a question. "Strange. Nobody ever heard Thomas mention him before. They met 15 years ago," Eli said calmly. "Up in the high country. I've been living in the mountains since then, but when I heard Thomas had passed, I felt obligated to help his daughter bring in the crop." "Obligated?" Mr. Patterson repeated, his tone suggesting he thought there might be other obligations at play. "Yes," Eli said, his voice flat and uncompromising. "A debt of honor. The kind of thing that matters between honest men." Mr. Patterson had the grace to flush slightly. He finished tallying the purchases and accepted Clara's payment without further comment. As they left the store, Clara said quietly, "That's going to be the pattern, isn't it? Suspicion and judgment everywhere we go." "Probably," Eli agreed. "But it'll die down eventually. Once people see we're serious about working the farm, once they realize there's nothing scandalous actually happening, they'll find something else to gossip about." Their next stop was the county office, where they asked to see the property records for the Hensley farm. The clerk, a thin man with wire-rimmed spectacles, brought out a large leather-bound book and spread it on the counter. "Here's your grandfather's original claim," he said, pointing to an entry dated 1862. "And here are the subsequent surveys confirming the boundaries. Most recent one was done in 1885. Clara and Eli studied the records carefully. The boundaries were clearly marked, with exact measurements and landmark descriptions. There was no ambiguity, no room for the kind of dispute Vernon Pritchard had suggested. "Has anyone else requested to see these records recently?" Eli asked. The clerk thought for a moment. "Now that you mention it, yes. Mr. Pritchard was in here about 2 weeks ago, asking about the Hensley property. Said he was interested in purchasing adjacent land and wanted to make sure of the boundaries." "Did he ask about disputed claims or contested surveys?" Clara asked. "He did," the clerk said. "But I told him the same thing I'm telling you. The boundaries have been surveyed 3 times over the years, and they've always come out the same. There's no legal basis for any boundary dispute. Would you be willing to testify to that if it came to court?" Eli asked. The clerk looked nervous. "Mr. Pritchard is an influential man, but the law is the law," Eli interrupted gently. "And the records speak for themselves. We're just asking if you'd be willing to state the truth if it became necessary." The clerk hesitated, then nodded slowly. "I suppose I would. The records are clear after all." "Thank you," Clara said. That's all we needed to know. As they left the county office, they nearly collided with Vernon Pritchard himself. who was entering with two of his men, including the scarred man who'd confronted them in the field. Well, Pritchard said, his eyes moving between Clara and Eli with undisguised calculation. Miss Hensley and the mountain man, I hear you two have been quite the scandal. We've been working, Clara said coldly, and bringing in the harvest that you said couldn't be done. Oh, I never said it couldn't be done, Pritchard said smoothly. Just that you couldn't do it alone. And I see I was right about that. She's not alone anymore, Eli said quietly. Pritchard's eyes narrowed. That's so. You planning to stick around after the harvest, mountain man? I am, Eli said. As Miss Hensley's partner. Partner, Pritchard repeated, loading the word with insinuation. That what they're calling it these days? Eli took a step forward, his body language shifting subtly from peaceful to threatening. You'd best watch your mouth, Pritchard. Clara's reputation is not something I'll hear you besmirch. For a moment the two men faced each other, Pritchard red-faced and blustering, Eli calm but dangerous. The scarred man moved his hand toward his gun, but Eli's eyes flicked to him, and something in that cold grey gaze made the man freeze. There's a problem here, gentlemen. The voice came from behind them. The town sheriff, an older man named Wallace, who'd known Thomas Hensley for years. No problem, Sheriff, Pritchard said, forcing a smile. Just making conversation with our neighbors. Looked like more than conversation to me, Sheriff Wallace said. He turned to Clara. You doing all right, Miss Hensley? I'm fine, Sheriff, Clara said. We were just leaving. Good idea, the sheriff said. He looked at Pritchard. And Vernon, maybe you should find some other business to attend to. Let these folks go about their day in peace. Pritchard's jaw tightened, but he stepped aside. Of course, Sheriff. Always happy to keep the peace. As Clara and Eli walked back to where they'd left the wagon, Sheriff Wallace followed them. Your father was a good man, he said to Clara, and I'm glad you've got help with the farm. But I'll be straight with you. Pritchard's been making noise about various issues with your property. Boundary disputes, unpaid debts, that sort of thing. None of it seems to have any legal basis from what I can tell, but he's persistent. We just checked the property records, Clara said. The boundaries are clear and undisputed. That's what I figured, the sheriff said. But you watch yourself. Vernon doesn't like to lose, and he's got money enough to make trouble for folks he doesn't like. We'll be careful, Eli said. But we won't be intimidated either. The sheriff studied Eli for a moment. You plan on staying around? Really, I mean. I do, Eli said. Then you should know. Marriage would make things easier, not just for her reputation, but legally. A married woman with a husband to stand with her, that's a lot harder for someone like Pritchard to push around than a woman alone with a hired hand. Eli's not a hired hand, Clara said quickly. He's my partner. I understand that, the sheriff said. But in the eyes of the law and in the eyes of this town, there's a difference between a partner and a husband. Just something to think about. After the sheriff left, Clara and Eli loaded the supplies into the wagon in silence. When they were done, Eli said, He's right, you know, about marriage making things easier. Are you proposing? Clara asked, trying to keep her tone light. Not like this, Eli said. Not standing in the street with half the town watching. But he's right about the practical benefits. And beyond that, he paused, seeming to search for words. I know we agreed to take things slow to see where things went. But the truth is, I already know where I want this to go. I want to stay here, build a life with you, be the partner you need in every sense of the word. If you need time to be sure, I understand. But I'm already sure. Clara felt her heart swell. I'm sure too, she said softly. I think I have been since you showed up that first morning. It just took me a while to admit it to myself. So you'd marry me? Eli asked. If I asked properly? Yes, Clara said. I would. Eli smiled, that full, genuine smile that transformed his weathered face. Then consider yourself asked properly the next time we're somewhere more private and romantic than a dusty street in town. They drove home in comfortable silence. Both of them smiling, both of them feeling like the future had suddenly opened up in unexpected and wonderful ways. But their mood changed when they arrived back at the farm and saw smoke rising from the direction of their wheat. Fields, fire, Eli said sharply. Already spurring his horse forward, Clara whipped the wagon horses into a gallop, her heart pounding with fear. Fire in dry wheat fields could destroy everything in minutes, could undo all their weeks of work and leave her with nothing. As they crested the hill that overlooked the farm, they could see that it wasn't a full-fledged wildfire, not yet. Someone had set fire to one of their bundled stacks of wheat, and the flames were just beginning to spread to the nearby bundles. Eli was off his horse before it fully stopped, running toward the well with a bucket. Clara jumped from the wagon and did the same, and together they began a desperate race against the flames, hauling water and dousing the fire before it could spread beyond control. It took 20 minutes of frantic work, both of them soaked with water and sweat, both of them coughing from the smoke, before they finally had the fire contained. When it was out, they stood looking at the damage, 3 full stacks of bundled wheat destroyed, another 2 damaged but salvageable. "Pritchard," Clara said, her voice shaking with rage. "Probably," Eli agreed. "Or his men on his orders. Can we prove it?" "No," Eli said. "That's the problem. Unless we catch someone in the act, it's just our word against his." Clara sank down onto the ground, suddenly exhausted. They'd worked so hard, come so far, and now someone was actively trying to destroy what they'd built. "I'm tired, Eli," she said quietly. "I'm tired of fighting, tired of constantly looking over my shoulder, tired of wondering what he'll do next." Eli sat down beside her, his arm going around her shoulders in a gesture of comfort that felt entirely natural. "I know," he said, "but we're not going to let him win. We've come too far for that. What do we do?" "We finish the harvest," Eli said. "We get every last stalk of wheat cut and bundled and sold. And then we make it very clear that this farm has permanent protection, that you're not alone anymore, that anyone who tries to harm what's yours will have to deal with me. Will that be enough?" "It'll have to be," Eli said, "because we're not giving up, not now, not ever." They sat there together as the sun moved lower in the sky, the smell of burned wheat acrid in their nostrils. Both of them grim and determined, and more bonded than ever by shared adversity. This wasn't how Clara had imagined building a life with someone would feel. She'd thought it would be peaceful, gentle, full of quiet moments and slow growth. But maybe this was more honest. 2 people tested by fire, literally and figuratively, choosing to stand together despite the cost. "We should get back to work," Clara said finally. "We've lost most of a day and we can't afford any more delays." "Tomorrow," Eli said. "Tonight we rest. And tomorrow we work twice as hard." That evening Eli didn't play his harmonica. Instead, they sat on the porch in silence, both of them too drained for music or conversation. But it was a companionable silence, the kind that comes from shared understanding and mutual support. "Tell me about what you want," Clara said eventually. "After the harvest is done, after all this is settled, what do you want our life to look like?" Eli thought for a long moment. "Simple things," he said finally. "Good work, fair dealing. A home that feels safe. Someone to share meals with, to talk to at the end of the day. Maybe eventually," he paused, "maybe eventually children, a family. The things I thought I'd left behind forever." "That sounds perfect," Clara said softly. "What do you want?" Eli asked. "The same," Clara said. "All of that. And I want to prove that a woman can run a farm, that I'm not just my father's daughter, but my own person. I want to make him proud." "You already have," Eli said. "Trust me, Clara. Thomas would be so proud of you he'd burst. The way you've fought for this place, the way you've refused to give up, that's exactly what he would have wanted." Clara felt tears sting her eyes. "You really think so?" "I know so," Eli said firmly. "And when this is all over, when the harvest is in and the farm is secure, I'm going to tell you something he'd want you to know. But not yet. When it's done, when we've earned it. What is it?" Clara asked. "You'll see," Eli said with a small smile. "Patience." They went to bed that night, with the smell of smoke still lingering in the air, with ash on their clothes and fear in their hearts. But they also went to bed with hope, with determination, with the knowledge that whatever came next, they'd face it together, and somewhere in the darkness, Vernon Pritchard sat in his large house counting his money and planning his next move. unaware that what he was facing wasn't a frightened girl anymore. It was two people who'd found something worth fighting for, and they weren't going to lose. Sunday morning dawned clear and bright, with a crispness to the air that promised autumn wasn't far off. Clara woke early, as always, but this time she took her time getting ready. She bathed carefully, washing away the dust and sweat of weeks of labor, and pinned her hair up in a style her mother had once shown her, simple but elegant. With a few loose tendrils framing her face, she put on her best dress, the blue one she'd worn to town, and added her mother's pearl earrings, the only jewelry her mother had owned, passed down from her own mother before her. Looking at herself in the small mirror, Clara barely recognized the woman staring back. She looked older than 24, but also stronger, more sure of herself. Today she was getting married. The thought filled her with a mixture of excitement and nervous energy. She'd known Eli less than a month, but it felt like she'd known him forever. Or maybe it was just that she knew herself better now, knew what she wanted, what she needed, what she was willing to fight for. She went downstairs to find Eli already in the kitchen, dressed in clothes she'd never seen him wear before. A proper suit, slightly worn but well kept, the kind a man would save for weddings and funerals. His hair was neatly combed, his beard freshly trimmed, and he looked so different from the dusty field worker she'd grown accustomed to that she stopped in the doorway and stared. "You look beautiful," he said, and the reverence in his voice made her blush. "You clean up pretty well yourself," she managed. They had a quiet breakfast together, neither of them eating much, both too nervous and excited for food. Then they hitched Betsy to the wagon and drove to town together, the morning sun warm on their faces. Clara had arranged for Reverend Matthews to perform the ceremony. He was an old man, semi-retired, who'd known her father and had agreed to marry them without asking too many questions about the speed of their courtship. They met him at the small church on the edge of town, and he greeted them with kind eyes and a gentle smile. "Thomas Hensley was a good man," he said to Clara, "and I believe he'd approve of this match. I can see the way you two look at each other. That's not convenience or desperation. That's the real thing." "It is," Clara said simply. The ceremony was short and simple, just the three of them in the empty church, with sunlight streaming through the plain windows. Reverend Matthews spoke about commitment and partnership, about the covenant of marriage being not just about love, but about choosing to stand together through whatever life brought. When it came time for the vows, Eli took Clara's hands and spoke in a voice rough with emotion. "I promise to work beside you, to stand with you, to honor you and protect you for as long as I live. I promise to be worthy of your trust and your love. And I promise that this farm, this life we're building, it will always be ours, not just mine." Partners in everything. Clara's own vows were equally simple and heartfelt. "I promise to respect you, to value you, to build this life with you as an equal. I promise to trust you with my heart and my future. And I promise that whatever comes, we face it together." Reverend Matthews pronounced them husband and wife, and when Eli kissed her, Clara felt something settle into place inside her chest, a sense of rightness, of completion, of having found what she'd been searching for without even knowing she was searching. They signed the marriage certificate with Reverend Matthews and his wife as witnesses, and then they were done, married, bound together by law and love and mutual choice. "What now?" Clara asked as they stood outside the church. "Now we go home," Eli said. "To our home. And we start our life together." But as they walked toward the wagon, they saw a group of riders approaching, Vernon Pritchard and 6 of his men, all armed, all looking like they meant business. Well, Pritchard said, reining in his horse and looking down at Clara and Eli with cold eyes. "Heard you two were getting married. Thought I'd come offer my congratulations." "Thank you," Clara said carefully. "Now, if you'll excuse us—" "Not so fast," Pritchard interrupted. "I've got some business to discuss. That mortgage on your farm, the one your father took out, it's coming due soon. I've purchased the note from the bank, and I'll be expecting payment in full by the end of the month." "You purchased a note that doesn't exist," Eli said calmly. "The bank president has already confirmed that Thomas Hensley's actual loan was nearly paid off. And the forged document you tried to use was fraudulent. Pritchard's expression darkened. I don't know what you're talking about. Yes, you do, Clara said, finding her courage. You tried to forge documents to steal my farm. It didn't work. My father's real debts are minimal and will be paid from this year's harvest. You have no claim on my property. Your property, Pritchard said and laughed harshly. Interesting, because I've done some research, and it turns out there's a question about whether your grandfather had clear title to that land in the first place. The original homestead claim might have been invalid. It wasn't. Reverend Matthews's voice came from behind them. The old preacher had emerged from the church and was standing on the steps, his expression stern. I was there when Benjamin Hensley filed his claim in 1862. I witnessed the paperwork myself. The title was clear then, and it's clear now. What you're doing, Vernon, is bearing false witness. That's a sin, in case you've forgotten. This is none of your business. Preacher, Pritchard snarled. It is when you're harassing a couple I just married on the steps of my church, Reverend Matthews replied. And it is when you're trying to defraud a member of my congregation. I may be old, Vernon, but I'm not blind. And I'm not deaf. I know what you've been doing. The intimidation, the property damage, the forged documents. And I'm willing to testify to what I know if it comes to that. Pritchard looked around and seemed to realize that other people were watching now, townspeople, who'd heard the commotion and come to see what was happening. His expression shifted, and Clara recognized the calculation in his eyes. Whatever he'd planned to do here, he wasn't willing to do it with witnesses. This isn't over, he said, pointing at Clara. You think you've won because you got yourself a husband, but all you've done is drag him into something that's going to end badly for both of you. The only thing that's going to end badly, said a new voice, is your harassment of these good people. Sheriff Wallace had arrived, dismounting from his horse and walking up to stand beside Clara and Eli. I've been hearing some interesting things about you lately, Vernon. Forged documents, property damage, intimidation. Now, I can't prove all of it yet, but I'm watching. And I'm telling you right now, in front of all these witnesses, you leave the wards alone or you'll answer to the law. The wards, Pritchard repeated bitterly. He looked at Clara and Eli with pure hatred. Fine, keep your pathetic little farm. Work yourselves to death on that hard ground. But don't come crying to me when you can't make it work, when the debts pile up and the crops fail. I won't be offering to buy again. Good, Clara said. Because we wouldn't sell. Pritchard wheeled his horse around and rode off, his men following. The gathered crowd dispersed slowly, and Sheriff Wallace tipped his hat to Clara and Eli. Congratulations on your marriage, he said, and good luck. I think you've made an enemy today, but you've also made it clear you won't be pushed around. That counts for something. After the sheriff left, Clara and Eli climbed into their wagon and headed home. They were quiet for the first mile, both of them processing what had just happened. I'm sorry, Clara finally said. You married me a few minutes ago, and already you're being threatened by Vernon Pritchard. That's not much of a wedding gift, Clara, Eli said gently. I knew what I was getting into. I've known since that first day that standing with you meant standing against Pritchard. And I chose it anyway because you're worth it. This farm is worth it. Our future is worth it. Still, Clara said. I wish our wedding day could have been perfect. It was perfect, Eli said. We got married. We stood up to a bully. We had the whole town witness that we're not backing down. That's about as perfect as it gets. Clara laughed despite herself. I suppose when you put it that way, that's the only way to put it, Eli said. He reached over and took her hand. We're married, Clara. You're my wife, I'm your husband, and nothing Pritchard does or says can change that. This is our beginning. Our beginning, Clara repeated, and smiled. They arrived home to find the farm looking beautiful in the afternoon light, their fields cut clean and neat, the bundled wheat ready for threshing and sale, the farmhouse solid and welcoming. This was theirs now, not just hers but theirs, a shared future, a shared responsibility, a shared home. I have something for you, Eli said as they climbed down from the wagon. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small package wrapped in cloth. Clara unwrapped it carefully and found a simple gold band, a wedding ring, worn but lovely. It was my mother's, Eli said quietly. The only thing I kept when I left Pennsylvania. I was saving it, I don't know what for, really. But now I know. It was for you. Clara's eyes filled with tears as Eli slipped the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly, as if it had been made for her. Thank you, she whispered. I'll treasure it, and I'll treasure you, Eli said, pulling her close. Every day for the rest of our lives. They stood there in the yard holding each other, and for the first time since her father's death, Clara felt completely at peace. The struggles weren't over. Pritchard would probably keep causing trouble, and running a farm was never easy. But none of that mattered right now. Right now, she was home. She was loved. She was exactly where she belonged. Come on, Eli said, taking her hand. Let's go inside. I want to carry my bride over the threshold properly. Clara laughed. That's superstition. Maybe, Eli agreed. But humor me. He swept her up into his arms, and Clara shrieked with surprised laughter as he carried her through the door of the farmhouse. Their farmhouse now. Their home. The place where they'd build their life together. Inside, everything looked the same but felt different. The kitchen where she'd cooked so many meals alone would now be shared. The table where she'd eaten in silence would now be filled with conversation. The rooms that had echoed with emptiness would now ring with companionship. Eli set her down gently and kissed her, and this kiss was different from the one in the church, deeper, more passionate, full of promise and desire, and the knowledge that they had all the time in the world to explore what they meant to each other. When they broke apart, both slightly breathless, Clara said, I love you, Eli Ward. I love you too, Clara Ward, he replied, and the sound of her new name sent a thrill through her. Clara Ward, wife, partner, farmer, fighter, survivor. She was all of those things now, and she was ready for whatever came next. Outside, the sun moved across the sky, painting the wheat fields gold. The harvest was done, the wedding was over, and the real work, the work of building a life together, was just beginning, and Clara couldn't wait. 5 years had passed since that scorching July morning when Eli Ward had ridden out of the mountains and into Clara's life. 5 years of seasons turning, crops growing, and a family building something that would last. The farm had prospered beyond anything Thomas Hensley might have imagined. The original 300 acres had grown to nearly 500, with diversified crops that protected them from the vagaries of any single harvest. They ran a small but profitable cattle operation, kept chickens and pigs, and had even built a small orchard that was beginning to produce fruit. But the farm's success was measured in more than acreage and profit. It was measured in the laughter of children. Thomas, now 5 years old and already showing signs of his grandfather's love for the land, and his younger sister Margaret, just 3, who followed her brother everywhere with determined adoration. It was measured in the respect of their neighbors, the friendship of their community, the knowledge that they'd built something honest and lasting through hard work and integrity. Clara stood at the kitchen window on a late autumn afternoon, watching Eli teach Thomas how to properly stack firewood for the winter. Their son was serious and focused, mimicking his father's movements with the kind of concentration that made Clara's heart swell with pride and love. Margaret sat nearby, playing with a cornhusk doll, singing to herself in the unself-conscious way of small children, her dark curls catching the afternoon light. This was Clara's life now. Not the lonely, desperate struggle she'd faced 5 years ago, but something rich and full and deeply satisfying. Every morning she woke grateful. Every evening she went to bed content. There were still challenges, of course. Farming was never easy. Last year's drought had been worrying until late rains saved the corn crop. A coyote had gotten into the chicken coop, and they'd lost half their laying hens before Eli tracked it down. Thomas had fallen from the barn loft and broken his arm, giving them both a terrible scare. But these were normal problems, manageable difficulties, the kind that came with any life well lived. They weren't the existential threats she'd faced that terrible summer, weren't losses that could break her. She heard the door open and turned to see Eli and Thomas coming inside. Both of them flushed from the cool air and physical work. "We got it all stacked, Mama," Thomas announced proudly. Every piece, just like Papa showed me. Good work, Clara said, ruffling his hair. Now go wash up for supper. After Thomas ran off, Eli came to stand beside Clara at the window, his arm sliding naturally around her waist. It was a gesture so familiar, so much a part of their daily life, that Clara barely noticed it anymore. But sometimes, like now, she'd pause and marvel at it, the casual intimacy of a long marriage, the comfort of being with someone who knew you completely and loved you anyway. He's getting so big, Eli said, watching Thomas play with his sister through the window. They both are, Clara agreed. Sometimes I can barely remember when they were babies. You think about having more. Eli asked. Clara considered. Maybe. If it happens, it happens. But I'm content with what we have. 2 healthy children, a good life. That's more than enough for me. More than enough, Eli echoed, kissing the top of her head. That evening, after the children were in bed and the house was quiet, Clara brought out her father's journal. She'd been reading through it again recently, finding comfort in his words, in the connection to him that the pages provided. Listen to this, she said to Eli, who was sitting by the fire with one of his books. This is from about a month before he died. She read aloud. Clara is worried about the harvest, though she tries not to show it. I wish I could tell her not to worry, that everything will work out. But how can I promise that when I don't know how much time I have left? My heart has been troubling me more lately. I should see the doctor, but there's always too much work, always something more urgent. If something happens to me, I pray that Eli Ward will honor the promise he made 15 years ago. I pray that Clara will let him help her. I pray that they'll find in each other what Sarah and I had. A partnership built on respect and affection that deepens into real love over time. That would be the best legacy I could leave, not just this land, but the knowledge that my daughter won't be alone. Clara's voice caught on the last words, and Eli set down his book and came to sit beside her. He knew, Eli said quietly. He'd planned for it all along. And you came, Clara said, looking at him. You honored that promise, and you gave me everything he hoped for. More than he hoped for. I got as much as I gave, Eli said. You saved me too, Clara. I was barely living up in those mountains, just existing. You brought me back to life. They sat together in comfortable silence, the fire crackling, the house settling around them with the familiar creaks and sighs of a well-loved home. Do you ever wonder what your father would think? Eli asked. About all this? The farm, the children, the life we've built? Clara closed the journal and held it to her chest. I don't have to wonder, she said. I know exactly what he'd think. Tell me, Eli said. Clara stood and walked to the window, looking out over their land, bathed in moonlight. The fields that had nearly broken her, that had seemed like impossible burdens, now represented security and prosperity and a future for her children. She turned back to Eli and smiled, repeating the words that had become sacred to them both. The words that had marked the end of their first harvest together and the beginning of everything else. He'd be proud. Eli came to stand beside her, and together they looked out at what they'd built. Not just a farm, though it was that. Not just a family, though it was that too. But a life, a real, full, meaningful life, built from loss and work and hope and love. The next morning, Clara woke to the sound of Thomas calling excitedly from the yard. She dressed quickly and went outside to find her son pointing at the eastern hills. Look, Mama, a rider. Clara shaded her eyes and looked where he was pointing. Sure enough, a lone figure on horseback was making its way down from the mountain passes, heading toward their farm. For just a moment, Clara felt a jolt of memory. Another morning, another rider, her heart full of fear and desperate hope. But this was different. She wasn't alone anymore. She wasn't afraid. Eli came out of the barn, saw the rider, and walked over to stand beside Clara. Expecting anyone? No, Clara said. But that's all right. Whoever it is, they're welcome here. The rider turned out to be a young man, maybe 25, with a worn look about him and eyes that held old pain. He dismounted politely and introduced himself as Daniel Cooper, recently discharged from the army and traveling west looking for work. I heard in town that you folks might need an extra hand, he said. I'm good with horses and cattle, know my way around a farm, and I'm willing to work hard for fair wages. Clara and Eli exchanged glances. They had been talking about hiring help for the spring planting, especially with their expanded acreage. And there was something about this young man that reminded Clara of Eli 5 years ago. That same look of someone searching for a place to belong, for purpose, for a second chance. We might have work, Eli said carefully. But I'll be straight with you. We expect honest labor and honest dealing. If that's what you're offering, we can talk terms. That's all I want, Daniel said. A fair chance to prove myself. They hired him on a trial basis, and he proved to be exactly what he'd claimed. Hard-working, honest, grateful for the opportunity. Over the following months, he became part of their operation. Living in a small cabin, Eli and some neighbors helped him build on the edge of their property. And watching Daniel find his footing, watching him slowly shed the haunted look that had marked him when he arrived, Clara understood something profound. Her father's legacy wasn't just land and buildings and lessons learned. It was this, the willingness to help someone who needed it, to offer opportunity to someone searching for purpose, to pass forward the kindness that had once been shown to you. Eli had come to them when they needed help. Now they were helping Daniel, and someday perhaps Daniel would help someone else. That was how it worked, how it was supposed to work. Not charity, but community. Not pity, but recognition of shared humanity. That summer, with Daniel's help, they had their biggest harvest yet. The wheat stood tall and golden, swaying in the wind that came down from the mountains, and Clara thought about how far they'd come. From that terrible day 5 years ago, when her father had collapsed in these very fields, when everything had seemed lost, to now, prosperity and peace and a future stretching out before them like those wheat fields, golden and full of promise. On the anniversary of Thomas Hensley's death, Clara and Eli took their children up to the cemetery on the hill. They'd been doing this every year, wanting Thomas and Margaret to know their grandfather through stories and visits, to understand where they came from and the sacrifices that had been made to give them this life. Thomas, the boy, placed wildflowers on his namesake's grave with 5-year-old solemnity. Margaret, not quite understanding but wanting to participate, added a handful of wheat stalks she'd picked from the field. "Tell us about Grandpa," Thomas asked. As he always did, and Clara told him as she always did, about a man who'd worked this land with his own hands, who'd faced down drought and death itself with quiet courage, who'd loved his daughter enough to ensure she wouldn't face the future alone. "He sounds brave," Thomas said. "He was," Clara agreed. "The bravest man I ever knew, except maybe your father." Eli shook his head. "Your grandfather was braver," he said to Thomas. "I just did what any decent man would do, kept a promise. Your grandfather built something from nothing, raised a daughter alone, and never gave up even when things seemed impossible. That takes real courage." They stood together at the graveside, a family paying respects to the man who'd made it all possible. And Clara felt her father's presence there, not in any supernatural sense, but in the lives they lived, the values they held, the way they treated others and themselves. This was his legacy. This was what endured, not just land, though the land would remain, not just buildings, though the farmhouse stood solid and strong, but this, love and family and integrity and the simple determination to build something good in a world that sometimes made that difficult. As they walked back down the hill toward home, little Margaret reached up and took Clara's hand. "Mama," she said in her small, serious voice, "do you think Grandpa can see us?" Clara looked back at the cemetery, then at her daughter's upturned face. "I think he can," she said. "And I think he's proud of us, because we work hard." Thomas asked. "Because we love each other," Clara corrected. "Because we help people who need it. Because we're building a good life on the land he loved. That's what would make him proud." They walked home through the golden afternoon, Thomas running ahead to check on something in the barn, Margaret singing her nonsense songs, Eli and Clara walking hand in hand behind them, and in that moment Clara felt a sense of completion. The circle that had begun with her grandfather claiming this land, that had continued through her father's stewardship and sacrifice, that had nearly been broken by her father's death. That circle was unbroken, now strong, ready to be passed to the next generation. Thomas, both. The grandfather who died and the grandson who bore his name would carry this legacy forward. And Margaret too, and their children after them, and their children's children, each generation adding their own chapter to the story. Their own sweat and sacrifice and love to the land. The sun was setting as they reached the farmhouse, painting the sky in shades of gold that matched the wheat they'd harvested, the life they'd built, the future that stretched out before them full of possibility and promise. Eli stopped on the porch and pulled Clara close, kissed her in the way of people who'd loved each other long enough that every kiss was both familiar and precious. "Thank you," he said quietly. "For what?" Clara asked. "For letting me stay," Eli said. "For building this life with me. For everything. Thank you for coming," Clara replied. "For keeping your promise. For being exactly who you are." They stood together, watching their children play in the yard, watching the sun sink lower, watching the evening stars begin to emerge in the darkening sky. And Clara thought about that first morning 5 years ago, when she'd been alone and desperate and facing an impossible task. She thought about the stranger who'd ridden down from the mountains with nothing but a promise and a determination to honor a debt. She thought about her father, who'd planned for this even in death, who'd set in motion the events that would save her when she needed saving most of all. She thought about the words that had become their family's creed, the words that captured everything they'd been through and everything they'd become, words spoken by a mountain man to a lonely cowgirl, over freshly harvested wheat in the golden light of a summer evening, words that had proven true in ways neither of them could have imagined. He'd be proud, yes, Clara thought, looking at the life they'd built, the family they'd created, the legacy they'd preserved and expanded. Yes, he would be proud of all of it, of her, of Eli, of their children and their farm and their future, and that knowledge, more than anything else, more than prosperity or peace or even happiness, that knowledge filled her with a contentment so deep and so complete that she knew, whatever challenges lay ahead, whatever storms might come, they would weather them together, just as they'd weathered everything else, one day at a time, one season at a time, one harvest at a time. Together, always together. That was the promise they'd made to each other, the promise they'd keep for all the days of their lives. And somewhere, in the vast and unknowable mystery of what comes after death, Thomas Hensley smiled and rested easy, knowing his daughter, his strong, stubborn, beautiful daughter, had found exactly what she needed. She'd found home, she'd found love, she'd found herself, and she'd never be alone again. The end.